We want to start actually with the news that the president has made. Your boss and our president has just said that there will be massive tax cuts as part of an overall tax reform plan that we should see Wednesday of next week or shortly thereafter, to use his words. Yeah. He wouldn't have said that if you hadn't told him he could say it, that he would have something to show us. So you know what's in that plan. I'm not going to ask you what's in the plan, but I'm going to ask you about one specific thing. Very important thing, and that is the border adjustment tax. This is something that the Speaker Orion has said is very important. The estimates are it's a $1.1 trillion that would pay for a lot of those massive tax cuts. The White House has not really come down one way or the other. Has the White House taken a position? Has the president decided on the BAT?
Yeah, not yet. I can tell you that it's been the center of our discussions for the past several weeks. Secretary Mnuchin over at Treasury, Gary Cohn here at the NEC have sort of been leading our team on tax reform. And the border adjustment tax, it's a centerpiece of the House proposal, at least the early forms of the House proposal, have obviously been part of our discussion. I think it's fair to say we've not settled yet one way or the other, but my guess is you'll know by next week.
That would be good when we get the plan. But I must say, we had Ken Langone. You know Ken Langone. He's a real supporter of President Trump. And he was on with us just yesterday, and he saw that the border adjustment tax would be a great thing for America, in part because it would be part of a plan that would get growth going again in this country. And that would help, including his own Home Depot that he co-founded. So what's the hang-up? Why not have border adjustment tax?
Well, Ken's perspective is absolutely right and entirely consistent with what direction we're coming at it from in the White House. Everything that we're looking at is keyed to growth. In fact, we're actually not starting with a tax plan. We're starting with a goal, and that goal is economic growth at 3% off into the future. And we're trying to backfill in from there. What tax policies give us the best chance of getting that long-term economic growth? Border adjustment tax gives you some aspects of that. Part of it, it also creates difficulties, not only difficulties in terms of the political difficulties, but difficulties in terms of certain market segments that don't benefit from it. I understand Mr. Langone, understand his views on how it would not be harmful and possibly helpful to Home Depot. There's other folks who think it is hurtful to them, and that's what we're trying to balance. Those are the equities you always deal with. One of the reasons it's been 30 years plus now since we've done a massive tax bill is they're very, very difficult to do. There's a lot of equities involved, a lot of people with skin in the game. And that's what we're going through right now. So we understand Mr. Langone, he has been a good supporter. We understand his position, and we're certainly taking that into consideration.
One of the issues, of course, is how you pay for those massive tax cuts. As I say, the border adjustment tax is one way to do it. If you can't go that way, do you have alternatives to come up with $1.1 trillion?
Well, keep in mind, there's a couple of options open to us. If we decide to make the law permanent, then it has to be revenue neutral. Actually, technically, it has to reduce the deficit outside the 10-year budget window. I know I just put half of your audience to sleep, but those are the arcane rules of the Senate budget, right? So, or excuse me, the Senate reconciliation. If we decide that instead it's more important to get economic growth, because again, that's what's driving the discussion. Deficits are not driving the discussion. Deficits are certainly part of the discussion, but we're not starting off saying, how do we do something that's deficit neutral? We're starting off saying, how do we get economic growth? And if we look at a larger tax plan, a more aggressive tax plan that perhaps adds to the deficit, it would have to be less than 10 years. So again, those are the sort of the balancing act we're trying to go through right now. We haven't settled yet on a smaller permanent plan or a bigger short-term plan.
So it's not just this tax reform package we're going to see next week. We also have something of a deadline you may have paid attention to on Friday, where the government could get shut down. I'm a little familiar with it, yeah. Yeah, no. So. And I understand both you and the president said it's probably not going to happen. You really think it's unlikely, although I know you are preparing for the worst at the same time. You've also said there has to be a negotiation with the Democrats, and there's certain things on the table. What is there in that negotiation as you go into it that you will walk away from the table if you don't get? Is it the wall?
Well, let's look at it this way, and why this is a critical juncture, I think, not only in this administration, but in Washington, D.C. I've said before that the next 4 days will tell you a lot about the next 4 years. We've finally boiled this negotiation down to something that we want very badly, that the Democrats really don't like, and that's the border wall. At the same time, there's something they want very badly that we don't like very much, which are these cost-sharing reductions, the Obamacare payments. Ordinarily, in a properly functioning Washington, D.C., as in any business, this would be the basis upon which a negotiated resolution could be achieved. The question is, how much of our stuff do we have to get? How much of their stuff are they willing to take? And that's the way it should work. That's the way that we hope that it works. We'd offer them $1 of CSR payments for $1 of wall payments right now. That's the offer that we've given to our Democrat colleagues. That should form the fundamental understanding that gets us to a bipartisan agreement. If the Democrats come back to us and say, look, we can't do that, we can do this, that's a really, really good sign, not only in the short term and the long term. If they simply walk away and choose to not participate in the discussions, that's a bad sign not only in the short term, but for the next several years.
So you and I aren't going to negotiate this right now, and I don't have any authority, unlike you. But is there a way around this if you don't?
You could give me some wall payments, then we have some basis for discussion.
Well, what about if it's not? We don't have the wall put in the bill. There's money in there for border protection, but you don't have to call it a wall. So the Democrats can say, we didn't agree to build a wall, but you have some money.
And again, you're absolutely right. I'm not trying to be coy, but I'm not going to negotiate over national media with my Democrat colleagues. I will say this. It should surprise no one. In fact, I know it doesn't surprise anyone that the actual physical southern wall is a priority, a top priority for this president. He ran on it. He won on it, and as every winning candidate always likes to say, elections have consequences. When President Obama won, he got some of his priorities, even though at the time, in 2012, Republicans controlled both chambers on Capitol Hill. This president should be allowed to have his highest priorities funded, even though the Democrats rightly have a seat at the table because of the Senate rules, and we're willing to give them some of their priorities in exchange. But you cannot expect a president who just won election to give up very easily on his highest priority.
So you know Congress very well. What are the chances that come Friday we won't have an answer one way or the other? That is to say, we'll have a series of like 1 week extensions. We'll run the government week to week into the summer. Is that a likelihood?
I think it's a lot more likely than a government shutdown. I don't see the atmosphere for a shutdown. A shutdown isn't a strategy. It's not a desired outcome. It's mostly a symptom of a system that hasn't functioned. So I think you're much more likely to see a short-term CR or a series of the same other than a complete lapse in funding.
One more thing that's coming up apparently very soon, according to the president, and that's the health care reform. There's going to be another attempt at that. The president said that. He said it's going to be really good. It's going to be coming out shortly. Do you have to get health care done before you can get back to that tax reform package?
Yeah, next week's going to be a busy week, right? We've got tax reform, now we got all these things. Do you have to? Technically, the answer is no, but in practical and political senses, the answer is probably yes. The tax bill cannot be as good as it otherwise would be, and by that I mean it cannot be as dramatic. It cannot be as powerful if you have not dealt with health care first. Also, there's things such you have to take into consideration the very real factor of political momentum. So for a bunch of different reasons, we think we get a much, much better tax bill, one that the president actually wants as opposed to one he has to settle for if we get health care first.
Well, it was widely reported that the problem with the AHCA, the first attempt actually, was with the Freedom Caucus, something you know a little bit about. You were one of the founding members of it. Are you confident you can come to terms with the Freedom Caucus and get through that?
Well, a couple different answers to that. First of all, it wasn't the Freedom Caucus that killed the bill. It was a broad swath of folks across the Republican Party. Keep in mind, roughly half of the Freedom Caucus actually supported the health care bill. We had about 18 Freedom Caucus no's and about 18 no votes from people who are outside the Freedom Caucus. So I think that narrative has been blown out of proportion just a little bit. But I do think it's important to know that the Freedom Caucus, the Tuesday group, the more centrist group within the party, and other folks who don't align with any particular faction have been talking over the course of the last 2 weeks. They've been organically discussing how they can come together on a bill, and that's what needs to happen. There are difficulties in the House the White House cannot fix. That was the reason the bill failed 4 weeks ago. And if it succeeds, it'll send a strong message that the House has actually started to mend itself and can function properly.
So finally, Director Mulvaney, because I want to respect your time here, we're coming up to the 100-day mark, an unofficial mark, but something everybody's looking at. One of your priorities, and the president's, has been deregulation. I know you feel you've made a lot of progress. You have an $86 billion number, I heard you put on what you've done so far. One of the president's main promises is to get growth in this country, as we talked about earlier, 3%, 3.5% growth. How much of that growth can you drive off of deregulation? Because although $86 billion is a big number in a $19 trillion economy, it's a drop in the ocean.
Actually, we believe, and we believe based upon some really good academic and intellectual research that have been done by outside parties, that we get twice the boost to GDP growth out of regulatory reform than we do out of the very best tax policies that we can come up with. That's how overregulated our economy has been. And the good news there is that there's a lot of things we can do, and in fact, a lot of things we already have done on the regulatory front to sort of send the signal to business that we're open for business again, and that this layer upon layer of regulation and overregulation, that era has come to a close, and I think you'll start to see that impact GDP as early as the second quarter of this year.